you as a resource to go back to, and there's going to be some key concepts that I myself had to kind of pause and figure out, and so I've tried to give some examples and to explain those things well. But if you look at the top of your notes there, in looking at, so what is this scientism that you speak of? Well, I would say that the religion of scientism, and J.P. Moreland in the book kind of defines it as, scientism is the view that the hard sciences, like chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy, provide the only genuine knowledge of reality. So anything that is non-scientific is not trustworthy, and everything that is not scientific is merely just kind of a value judgment. And that's your opinion, but it's not necessarily true. And another quote from the book was from philosopher of science Tom Sorrell, and he says, "Scientism is the belief that science, especially natural science, is the most valuable part of human learning, because it is much the most," and that's literally what he says, "much the most authoritative or serious or beneficial. Other beliefs related to this one may also be regarded as scientistic, e.g. the belief that science is the only valuable part of human learning. And what is crucial to scientism is not the identification of something as scientific or unscientific, but the thought that the scientific is much more valuable than the non-scientific, or the thought that the non-scientific is of negligible value." And again, so when you have competing truth claims, science will trump non-scientific concepts. So scientism would be intimately connected with these other isms. Naturalism, so a belief denying that an event or object has a supernatural significance, or specifically the doctrine that scientific laws are adequate to account for all phenomena. So naturalism would say that you are just made up of physical parts and components. And so we've looked at, earlier on in our Worldview class, we talked about human beings are a composition of body and soul, right? We have a material part and an immaterial part. Naturalism says, no, you are just a material part. Because again, this is rooted in the theory of evolution, that life has evolved over long periods of time, and everything exists according to the laws of nature, and then intimately connected also with materialism. So a belief claiming that physical matter is the only or fundamental reality, that all organisms, processes, and phenomena can be explained as manifestations or interactions of matter. Again, purely we are only material, and there are only material explanations for all things in the world, and even for ourselves. And then this is going to be connected with secularism, the principle of separation of the state from religious institutions. And so the influence of scientism, before I kind of get into what J.P. Moreland writes in the books, just think of headlines or names of articles that you may have come across in the newspaper or on the evening news. Have you ever seen an article or a headline that say, "Experts say," or "Scientists say," or just "Science"? And so whenever those types of statements are being made, science or scientists or experts, whoever they may be, they are being appealed to as the final authority, right? And whatever they say is the truth. And you see, and it would be an interesting kind of experiment, just this week, look at how many articles or things that you come across where the source of authority that is appealed to is just some type of a nebulous science or scientists or experts. Just make note of that. But this is, and again, I won't read through all of this, but I'll highlight the points that J.P. Moreland outlined of just talking about the influence of scientism. And so the first thing that he mentioned was that scientism puts Christian claims outside of the plausibility structure. So in the worldview of scientism, and speaking with somebody who is coming from this way of thinking, that they are immediately going to disregard you as a Christian. Why? Because you believe in something beyond the natural, something beyond the material. You're going to believe in miracles. You're going to believe in a supernatural being who works outside of the normal laws of the universe. And that's where so often professors who are very academic and really studying deeply in any given subject, they will be pushed and pressured out of college campuses because of if they have any type of an acknowledgement of a created being. If you want to look at an interesting documentary, Ben Stein years ago, the guy from the Clear Eyes commercials, who has that really, really dry voice, Clear Eyes, he did a documentary called Expelled. And what he did was he went around universities and told some stories basically about how legitimate professors who had any type of an inclination to reject evolution and acknowledge any type of an intelligent design, not necessarily even the God of the Bible, but basically just looking at creation and saying, it is evident that this is not an accident. Anybody who would even hint at that would be let go or face extreme pressure in a college and university setting. So it's a very well-done documentary. And again, this is the pressure that we are facing. Scientism, this worldview, is pushing out and basically attacking the plausibility of Christianity. And so a second influence of scientism is that it's brought several shifts that now define our culture. I'm at the top of page 2, and I'll run through these really quickly. The first shift is in the realm of religion and ethics, and there's been a shift from knowledge to blind faith. That religion is no longer a study of intellectual depth, and it's not a study of knowing things. It's actually just, well, you're accepting that in faith. There's been this separation between actually knowing something and just accepting something in faith. There's not a rational faith. There's this bifurcation in the eyes of the world. A second shift is in the realm of guidance for living one's life. And it used to be that we would live based upon what is true. We were seeking to understand what is true. And now, in the realm of the scientism's influence, the world makes decisions based upon whatever you feel like doing. What is it that satisfies your desires at this point in time? A third shift is in the area of ethics. So it goes from having a positive duty and a virtue to do, so having a responsibility to basically you can do whatever you would like to do as long as you don't harm anyone else. That becomes the dividing line and the evaluation of, should I do this? Is this right? Is this wrong? And the key question is, if this harms others, then I shouldn't do it. If it doesn't harm anybody else, then I can just do whatever I want. And all things are morally permissible as long as you don't harm anyone else. A fourth shift, it was related to the third, but it's manifested in the area of freedom, or we might say a biblical term of liberty. So moving from a classic model to a contemporary version, and I've quoted J.P. Moreland here because he provides a great example of what this looks like. So it says, classically, freedom meant the power to do what one ought to do. And thus one is free to play the piano if one has the skills, training, and knowledge necessary to play it. Similarly, one is free in life if one has the power to live in the way that one ought to live. And sexual freedom in this context meant the power to live a chaste, holy life and to engage skillfully in sexual activity in the way in which we were designed by God, in marital union between husband and wife. But contemporary freedom has come to be understood as the right to do whatever one wants to do, And sexual freedom in this context means the right to satisfy one's desires in any way one wishes, with the possible exception of not harming others. Again, see the previous point. And again, that's very much what the world is now proclaiming, that you have the right to do whatever you want to do, and that's the true definition of freedom. And so if that's how freedom is defined, if you may have the courage to say to somebody, I don't think you should do that. You are then, by this definition, what are you doing? Yeah, you are infringing upon their freedom. If you're going to tell me I can't do something or I shouldn't do something, that is now an infringement upon their freedom. And that's flows into the fifth and final shift that he mentions in the book. There's this shift of how we think about and practice tolerance. Moving from a classic model to a contemporary one. The classic principle of tolerance is that you tolerate other people, but at the same time you would be able to be intolerant or in disagreement with their ideas. So that you honored and respected people, but you could be disagreeing with what they were saying or thinking. And you had the freedom to do that, and that you could tolerate people in that sense. But this new practice of tolerance is that the very act of disagreeing with somebody is intolerant. So that you cannot even now be intolerant of an idea. And if you are intolerant of an idea that a particular person holds, you are also being intolerant of them as an individual. And so you can probably see those shifts in our own culture, in our own public discourse. And so the scientism has brought about these shifts in connection with some larger ideas that we've talked about in the past. But then also scientism has led to increasing hostility toward Christianity, as I mentioned in that documentary Expelled. And any college student who goes on to a major state university or secular campus, as soon as you say, I am a Christian, most professors there are going to paint a target on your back and are going to seek to deconvert you, so to speak, and to attack your faith in a profound and significant way. And then letter D there, scientism has derailed the church from making disciples and has made Christian parenting less effective. So what do I mean by that? There's a great quote on the top of page 3 explaining that. So in every culture in which the church is present, God's people are to avoid particular manifestations of the world in that culture. And however, to do this, it is not enough just to know Scripture. As Christians, we must also understand the systems of thought, practice, and value in our culture that are worldly, and be able to make this clear to fellow Christians and explain how to refute these ungodly systems using both biblical and non-biblical evidence. And then if you have your Bibles, you can open up to 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 through 5 that he points to there. And again, this is a wonderful apologetic passage and one to keep in mind. And this helps to frame the overall issue that we're even discussing in this worldview class. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 3 says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. And we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." Okay, the battle that we are facing in our culture right here and right now is not a battle of flesh and blood. It's a battle of ideas, right? And so in combating those ideas, we need first and foremost the truths of Scripture. And that's foundational. But then we also need to understand, what are these ideas that are coming at us? and what does the scriptures have to say about these ideas, and what does logic have to say about these ideas. As we're going to see in a little bit, God has created the world logically, and there are certain laws that must be obeyed and adhered to because God has created it and ordained it to be that way. And so this is why we're taking the time to even discuss this religion of scientism, because it creeps in more and more. And again, keep your eye out for those articles that are based upon experts or scientists or just the generic science. But let's look at Roman numeral 4 there. What are the errors of scientism? The errors of scientism. Well, first and foremost, scientism is self-refuting. Okay? Because again, if scientism is going to say that science is the only true way of knowing things, and if science is the final authority in all of life, then that's a claim that it's making, and we're going to hold it to that. But the scientific method is not able to prove science as the ultimate authority of knowledge. Matters of ultimate authority are not scientific. You can't conduct an experiment to prove science is the final authority in all of life. Those types of questions, matters of ultimate authority, are not scientific, but they are philosophical. They are non-material and cannot be tested and evaluated according to science. J.P. Moreland in the book says one of the great ironies of all of this is that scientism is not a doctrine of science, rather it is a doctrine of philosophy. More specifically, scientism is actually a doctrine of epistemology, which we talked about way back. That was our last class at the beginning of October. And epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies what knowledge is and how we obtain it. Okay? And so scientism itself is self-refuting, but then in addition to that, it can't prove itself. It pulls the rug out from under its own feet, because we've talked many times in the past about presuppositions, right? Presuppositions are those beginning foundational beliefs that support any and every worldview. And science builds upon certain presuppositions that it cannot prove and has no explanation for. So it accepts these ideas to be inherently true, but it can't prove that these ideas are true. Science builds upon a presupposition that the universe really exists. And we've talked about, I guess, in broader philosophical discussions, people are like, are we just in a dream? Or as I'll give an illustration later in my sermon about another possibility that's gaining popularity in our world right now. But science assumes that the universe really exists. Science assumes that the nature of the universe is ordered, right? That the universe operates according to fixed rules. The existence of objective truth is also an assumption of science. And again, the role of science, so you're trying to figure out what the world is like, right? You're going to conduct an experiment, you're going to make observations about the world around us, and you're seeking to understand truth that exists outside of you and exists in the universe itself. And so science presupposes the idea of objective truth. And you could call this the correspondence theory of truth, that a proposition is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. Science also assumes and presupposes the reliability of our senses and cognitive faculties for gaining truth and the knowledge of the world. Because in science, what are you constantly going to have to do? Make measurements, make observations. You're going to look at the stars, you're going to look at the earth, you're going to look at weather patterns, you're going to conduct experiments with chemistry and physics. The reliability of our senses and our thinking faculties to gain truth is presupposed. And then also the laws of logic and mathematics. And all of these things are assumed from the beginning in science, but science itself cannot prove any of these things. There's another quote there at the bottom. Even though science appeals to the laws of logic and mathematics and thus presupposes them, it cannot justify them. Why? For one thing, logic and mathematics are a priori fields, and that is, so a priori I have defined on top of page 4, a priori is relating to or denoting reasoning or knowledge which precedes from theoretic deduction rather than from observation or experience. So of you, we know and assume certain truths because, in essence, they are self-evident. They are the starting points. A priori are those presuppositions. And again, logic and mathematics or a priori fields, and that is the relevant laws are warranted by direct rational awareness without any appeal whatever to sense experience. And the sciences, however, are a posteriori disciplines, which I've also defined on the following page. So that's relating to or denoting reasoning or knowledge which proceeds from observations or experiences to the deduction of probable causes. Okay, so science is built upon gathering information that we observe, but it is, or I guess it's a posteriori, but a priori, like you understand that it cannot be raining and not raining at the same time, right? And you can understand that because that's a law of logic, and you can figure that out without even having that experience, because it's either one or the other, right? That's an a priori example of a law of logic that science builds upon, but cannot prove. It's dependent upon those things. But science would be a posteriori of like, how much is it raining and when does it rain? Like, and again, making observations. And a final presupposition of scientism specifically would be that scientific laws are adequate for explaining all phenomena, which is again naturalism. Okay, and we'll talk about that last presupposition a little bit later as well. You with me so far? Trudging along? Okay. If you guys have questions, just throw something at me to get my attention. Or raise your hand, whichever is easiest. If your aim's not that good, raising your hand may be more effective. All right, 6 things that scientism cannot explain, but a biblical worldview can explain. So J.P. Moreland in the book gave 5 of these, and I've added a 6th from another book that I came across. But 6 things that scientism is unable to explain. And this is really helpful to know and to keep in mind again, and to put these notes somewhere that you can refer back to them, because these are wonderful to bring up in a discussion or in a debate. And I give you all of this because, again, I want you to feel comfortable. Don't be overwhelmed when someone quotes an expert. Or they point to science or scientists. We can have confidence in what we believe because science cannot explain everything, beginning with the origin of the universe. Okay, and we can speak confidently about this. To quote J.P. Moreland in the book, causes that are physical or that are subject to scientific law presuppose time, space, and matter to exist. But since we are asking what caused time, space, and matter, the cause itself, meaning of those 3 things, must be something other than each of these. In other words, it must be timeless in order to cause time. It must be non-spatial in order to cause space. And it must be immaterial in order to cause matter. It must therefore be supernatural, capable of existing without the natural world and without being subject to the ultimate laws of nature. And so again, the dominant worldview right now would explain our existence and our origin with what event? The Big Bang, which they would explain as an infinitely dense piece of matter that exploded with energy, creating the universe. Now, what questions, if we're thinking critically, what questions should we ask of that? Where did the matter come from? Where did the energy come from that caused that explosion? Right? Because again, the laws of thermodynamics and other things, there's so much that we have to begin to realize. Science cannot explain those things. And again, that's a worthwhile question. So, where did that matter come from? Because the matter did not just exist out of nothing. Again, that's one of the laws of science, and that's one of the laws of biology. In so many ways of understanding the laws of science, and science is unable to prove the origin of the universe. And I love the way that he puts this here, of whatever is going to be the original cause of matter can't be made of matter, because if they are made of matter, then they're not the cause of matter. Like, again, it has to be something greater than and different from. If whoever created time has to be outside of time, and whoever created space has to be non-spatial. And what being does that sound like? That sounds like the God of the Bible. So letter B there, second thing that scientism cannot explain is the fundamental laws of nature. Okay? There must be, and it is widely agreed that there are, fundamental or foundational laws of nature. But the existence and precise nature of these laws cannot be explained by science, since all scientific explanations presuppose them. Now, as far as scientific explanation is concerned, these foundational laws are simply brute givens to be used to explain other things scientifically, but which themselves cannot be explained scientifically. Okay? So when scientists are conducting its experiments, and let's just say for the thinking through space exploration. I've recently listened to a couple books on the original Apollo space program, and how hard they worked to get to the moon, and they conducted many flights, and each one they expected that they would learn from the previous one, and that all of the world wouldn't change in the intervening time. Meaning that how much thrust it took the rocket to escape Earth's gravity in one launch, it would require that exact same amount of thrust to escape the Earth's gravity the next time, right? Why would that be? Because it's constant. There's fundamental laws that are always going to be true, and all of the scientists at NASA, whether they believed in God or not, assumed that those fundamental laws would be still the same over time, and no matter where they were on the Earth. Does that make sense? Those fundamental laws of nature are presupposed, but science cannot explain those. But then, a third thing that that scientism cannot explain is the fine-tuning of the universe. And all of these that listed out here come directly from the book Scientism and Secularism by Moreland. He says, the universe is a razor's edge of precisely balanced life-permitting conditions. And this is where another author has made a great point of those who would identify as atheists and they don't believe in God, they need to be a little bit more skeptical than they are. Because they're kind of accepting beliefs and ideas that without really understanding the significance of it and how unlikely it is that their assumptions are true because of this fine-tuning of the universe. So if gravity's force were infinitesimally stronger, all stars would burn too quickly to sustain life. And if ever so slightly weaker, all stars would be too cold to support life-bearing planets. So there's a very fine and small window that the power of gravity can exist in order for life to be sustained on our own planet, right? And guess where that gravity strength is? Right exactly in that window. And again, infinitesimal changes in either direction would mean no life. Number 3 there on your outline, if the ratio of electron to proton mass were slightly larger or smaller, the sort of chemical bonding required to produce self-replicating molecules could not obtain. And the same is true for the electromagnetic force in the universe. So basically, if you change any of those constant and those numbers, any of those fundamental laws change, life wouldn't be able to exist. Molecules wouldn't be able to adhere to one another. Now, if the strong nuclear force were slightly stronger, then the nuclei essential for life would be too unstable. And if it were slightly weaker, no elements but hydrogen would form. If the rate of the universe's expansion had been smaller by 1 part in 100,000 million, which is a very, very small number, the universe would have recollapsed and could not form or sustain life. Quantum laws are precisely what they need to be to prevent electrons from spiraling into atomic nuclei. Now, if the Earth took more than 24 hours to rotate, temperatures on our planet would be too extreme between sunrise and sunset. If the rotation of Earth were slightly shorter, wind would move at a dangerous velocity across the Earth's surface. If the oxygen level on our planet were slightly less, we would suffocate. If it were slightly more, spontaneous fires would erupt. You're like, maybe there's more oxygen over in California because of all of the forest fires that they're having over there. But those are amazing statistics, and that list could probably go on, and this has become known as the Goldilocks Problem, right? Of how is it that the Earth is exactly where it needs to be in our solar system, that all of these other numbers in the universe that could have been different, but they're not. All of this would point to the fact that the universe was prepared and created for life, because all of these things could have been different, but they are not. So that's a very powerful and persuasive argument. And again, this is also where atheists need to be more skeptical than they are, because of all of these actual scientific conclusions. A fourth thing that scientism is wrong on or cannot explain would be the origin of consciousness. And this is something that is very, again, theoretical and also profound. So the study of human consciousness is an excellent example of what happens when the hard sciences intrude into another field where they don't belong. And the primary academic disciplines suited to studying the nature of consciousness, and the self for that matter, are biblical studies, theology, and philosophy of mind. While the origin of consciousness is currently at the center of a storm, the nature of consciousness is actually pretty commonsensical. Again, that's a quote from the book. And how do you know what consciousness is and what its various states are? And so again, if consciousness is something different than, again, in scientism, they would just say every part of you can be explained by something happening in your brain, but scientism cannot explain consciousness, because something firing in your brain, a biological explanation, doesn't necessarily change based upon what words are going through your head at the time. Certain things are firing, but the voice in your head is saying different things. And that's, again, what science and scientism cannot explain. And so we'll look at what, again, clarifying consciousness. You know what consciousness is by having those states, right? By being in pain and by simply attending to them through first-person introspection. Okay? You understand what it means to be sad. Right? You understand what it means to be in pain because you have that experience. And second, states of consciousness are best defined ostensibly by citing or pointing to specific examples. In fact, a fairly good characterization of consciousness is this: consciousness is what you are aware of when you engage in first-person introspection. When you say to yourself, self, and whatever follows after that, that is your consciousness, and science is unable to explain how that has come into existence. That is not something that could possibly have evolved. So I've also, because this is kind of ambiguous, here's some examples of conscious states. So a sensation is a state of awareness or sentience, so a conscious awareness of sound or pain. So you have a sensation coming to you, and you are aware of it, you are conscious of it. A thought is another example, a mental semantic content that can be expressed in an entire sentence. A belief is a person's view constituted by semantic content, again, language, that it is raining. Is an example, accepted to varying degrees of strength of how things really are. Another example would be a desire, a certain felt inclination to do something, have something, or experience, or avoid certain things. And then a fifth example would be an act of will as a choice or an exercise of power in endeavoring to act, usually for the sake of some purpose. Again, if science can't explain why we choose what we choose. Or the choices of our will. And so this reality of consciousness, and consciousness can't be placed into anything else. Consciousness arises specifically really in human beings. Your dog is not conscious in the same way that we are. You know, they want food and desire sleep and other things, but they don't have the same type of consciousness. And again, we can explain that because they're not created in God's image. But scientism is unable to explain consciousness. And actually, in the book, J.P. Moreland had a whole an entire chapter on consciousness. So if you want more details on that, feel free to read the book. But another thing that he lists off, the fifth and final thing that he lists in the book would be the existence of objective, moral, rational, and aesthetic laws. So science can't explain why something is beautiful or why something should even be beautiful. Again, the lengthy quote here. If the universe began with a being who was himself the bearer of intrinsic goodness, rationality, and beauty, then there is no problem with how these things could exist or from where they came. However, if scientism is true, the entire history of the universe is a story of how strictly physical things, strings, waves, particles, etc., with strictly physical properties, mass, charge, size, location, and so forth, combining according to the laws of nature to form other strictly physical things with strictly physical properties. Again, that's naturalism. There's no immaterial. Everything about you and everything about the world can be explained by purely physical and material explanations. Now, if that is all that there is no need or room for intrinsic normative value properties, whether moral, rational, or aesthetic, to come to be. And as the late atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie admitted, the emergence of moral properties would constitute a refutation of naturalism and evidence for theism. Moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of properties and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Okay? And again, I know a lot of this is theoretical, but think about it along this lines. If the universe is only natural and material, why should we be morally outraged about anything? Right? On what grounds do we do that? On what grounds do we say that there is beauty in anything? How many of you, if you were coming from Nampa this morning, you had an amazing view looking out towards the sunrise, right? And when you see the sunrise, what do you think? That's beautiful. That's amazing. But again, you have innate within yourself a sense of wonder and awe at those things which are majestic and beautiful. But that cannot be explained just by pure natural explanations, right? Why does your brain have that setting of defining what is beautiful and what is not, right? How can you very clearly distinguish those things? And why would there be agreement among people about what is beautiful and what is not? That's what this atheist philosopher realized, is that the presence of moral and aesthetic and rational standards point to the reality and evidence for theism. So these are the five areas that J.P. Moreland added in. If scientism cannot explain these things, and I've added a sixth one, the development of human languages. And if you want to read a very interesting book, it's called The Kingdom of Speech, and it was written by a very well-known and well-respected journalist and author by the name of Tom Wolfe. and he is not a believer, but he wrote this book in which he tells the story about how evolution is unable to explain human language. So in the book, he tells a story of an academic, Noam Chomsky, who had been studying languages for 60 years and had brought all of these conclusions to the forefront of the academic field of how languages have evolved. And then there was a Christian missionary who had gone down and spent 30 years in the Amazon. And he wrote a book telling about his experience there. And he was also very studied and well-learned, and he wrote a very academic book explaining the language of the people that he had been ministering to in the Amazon for 30 years. And the evidence that he very clearly laid out in the book basically undid everything that Noam Chomsky had proclaimed and everything that 150 years of evolutionary language studies had concluded. And this missionary says, no, this is not the case. And he provides the examples for it. It's a very, very interesting book. And it's short, not long, but I would encourage you to read it. But in that book, Tom Wolfe cites an academic paper written by Chomsky and 3 other MIT professors. And basically, after 150 years of language studies, since the time of Darwin, and Noam Chomsky himself studying human languages for 60 years, from the 1950s to the 2010s, the conclusion these scholars came to was the evolution of the faculty of language largely remains an enigma, which is scientific code for we don't know. We're not sure. This is a mystery we cannot explain. And that was very evident in the book, and that was Tom Wolfe's point. Again, he wasn't arguing for theism. He wasn't arguing for Christianity. He's just saying evolution can't explain this. There is something more here that we can't figure out. And so that was a lot of information coming at you. If you turn page over, we only have a couple more pages. We're almost there. But let's talk for a minute about true science and a biblical worldview. Okay, you could categorize true science into a couple major categories. This is kind of my own categorization based upon how certain scientific fields are conducted. You could categorize one major arena of science as experimental science, which utilizes the scientific method to test a hypothesis and seek to develop a theory about how the world works. And you're probably familiar with the scientific method from your high school science classes, that you were taught this is how science is done. And that is true in certain arenas of science, in certain fields, right? Chemistry, biology, physics, medicine, where you can actually conduct an experiment where you have an independent and a dependent variable, and you manipulate things with an expectation that's going to result in this way, and then it's not what you thought, and so you re-examine the results, and well, maybe we'll try this. You're striving to figure out truth, objective truth about the world and about how things work through experimentation that you are controlling and manipulating. That's one major way of doing science. And another secondary way is observational science. And this utilizes, when you can't conduct an experiment, you have to simply make observations of the natural world and then use inductive reasoning, which is working from specific cases to reach general conclusions. So making observations and then using inductive reasoning to come to conclusions about the world. So no experiments are conducted, but observations are tested and examined for consistency and veracity. And so fields where this type of science would be practiced would be astronomy, meteorology, geography, and economics, right? You don't do scientific experiments with the stars. Why not? Because you can't reach the stars. You can make observations. You can learn about how they move. You can, observe planetary movements and motions, and you can make observations and try and create a mathematical formula that tries to fit there, but you're not going to actually do any experiments in astronomy. You're going to make observations, and then you're going to try and figure out some conclusions with good, sound logic and accurate observations. The same is also true with the weather or with geography. The erosions, you're going to see how the world is being shaped by weather and conduct certain things. So those are the fields where you're going to make observations and seek to understand. Right? Are we clear there? So experimental and observational. But then you also see the limitations of science, and these are acknowledged by science. And again, if you're going to make experiments, if you're going to make observations, the first limitation of science is if you're going to do science, you have to be able to observe whatever it is that you're going to test and try to figure out. If you can't observe it, you can't really do science, right? And again, it goes without saying, it's patently obvious, but it's very easy to overlook. And if you can't observe it, what are you moving into? You're moving away from science and into philosophy. You're moving into another category of thought. Additionally, the limitations of science, something has to be testable, right? If you cannot figure out a way to test or prove your hypothesis, then the process is short-circuited. Right? You can't do science if you cannot test your theory. Your theory and your experiment, especially in experimental science, but also in observational science, it must be repeatable. Right? Can this experiment be conducted and or verified by others? This mathematical formula that you have created that describes the movement of the Earth through the solar system. Other people can do what with that formula? They can plug in the numbers and evaluate your work, and they can give a response to it. And so it has to be testable. Can your experiment be conducted by others? So true science is going to be observable, testable, repeatable, and then also there's another concept, falsifiable. And this information came from a helpful article that I've cited there, which falsifiable is the idea of a statement, a hypothesis, or a theory is falsifiable if it can be contradicted by an observation. And if such an observation is impossible to make with existing technology, then falsifiability is not achieved. Generally speaking, no amount of experimentation can prove that a hypothesis is correct, but a single experiment can prove that it is incorrect. And that is the reason that falsifiability is an important principle of science. If you turn the page there, what are some examples of this idea of falsifiability? Bertrand Russell, who's an atheist philosopher, he gave a wonderful example. He states, and he said that there is a small teapot orbiting the sun that is too small to be seen with telescopes, right? And so Bertrand Russell uses this as a thought experiment to show that the burden of proof lies with those who make unfalsifiable claims. So if I say there is a teapot orbiting the sun that's too small to even be seen with telescopes, what's the problem there? Yeah. Exactly. And how do you know? All of those things. There's no way to falsify that. And so again, when that happens, you've moved out of the arena of scientific exploration and study into something different. An unfalsifiable claim would also be if it can't be disproved with observation. For example, and this is from that article, if you say aliens exist, there is no single observation that can disprove this. Now, in theory, you could inspect every inch of the universe to confirm the absence of life outside our planet, but that isn't feasible, right? So you can make this claim, aliens exist, but you just say, prove it, and you can't. And then within this article as well, I loved what I have there is number 2. This is what he explained, and this is also, it also pulls back the curtain a little bit, and you see what happens with the theory of evolution. So some hypotheses and theories are supported by overwhelming evidence but lack agreement on falsifiability. For example, it is somewhat difficult to falsify the theory of evolution by natural selection. And he gives this explanation for that. Hypothetical observations that could disprove the theory include very old fossils of modern animals such as the hippo. However, it can be argued that such a finding would simply result in a rework of the evolutionary history of the species along the lines of hippos evolved earlier than we thought. Now, this being said, a hippo fossil from the Precambrian era would be awfully difficult to explain with a theory of evolution and is a reasonable example of an observation that would falsify the theory. So what did he say happens there? So whenever the theory of evolution is falsified, whenever we find evidence that would say this doesn't fit the theory as it is currently stated, rather than disregarding the theory, what do? What did he say? There's an R word. They rework it. Maybe let's just adjust this little thing, and maybe there's this one exception over here. And this happens constantly because the theory of evolution has so many issues within it. Again, even atheistic journalist, Tom Wolfe is saying it can't explain language. That's a big mystery that it cannot address. And so the idea of falsifiability is very important. If you can't falsify it, then we're not branching into science, we're branching into philosophy. And so the presuppositions of science in submission to God and kind of in a biblical worldview. Again, we've talked about some of these in the past, but the first 5 are going to be identical to what we saw earlier in the presuppositions of science, but I put it in a way that assumes God in existence as well. That God brought the universe into existence. It really exists. God created the universe with an ordered nature. Objective truth exists in the universes and cognitive faculties that allow us to gain knowledge of the world that He has created. And God has woven the necessary truths of logic and mathematics into the fabric of the universe. These are called necessary truths because, there's no universe in which it could be both raining and not raining in the same place at the same time, right? The laws of logic persist, and 2 + 2 equals what? 4, and it will always equal 4. The laws of logic and mathematics are always going to be applicable. But then additionally, you could say this presupposition of science in submission to God, that God has at times worked in supernatural ways throughout human history. And that's how we explain the origin of the universe. That's how we explain the resurrection of Christ. That's how we explain human consciousness and the existence of human language. And then letter G, when both are rightly understood, science will not contradict the inspired and inerrant Word of God. And if you look at the history of science and really Western thought, all of the great Renaissance scientists, they were Christians. Right? They began scientific endeavors because they were sure that God existed and that He had created the world in an ordered way, and they were setting out to figure out what God had created and how everything worked. What were those laws? They were seeking to discover what God had created in the universe. And so if you look at the final page there, so some implications of this, and I hope that you would take them to heart. Number 1, we should not be intimidated by science. Okay, people can make a whole lot of claims on all of these things, and you can just ask, what makes science the authority? All right, and then you can let them give their explanation. You say, well, that's not actually a scientific argument. That's a philosophical argument. And I would love to talk with you about that. Secondly, we should not necessarily be afraid or shrink back from debating with others. Again, be convinced that the biblical worldview, the Christian worldview, is the only consistent worldview. All right, we have truth on our side. We can explain the things that no one else can. Again, going back to those things that we listed out, science and scientism cannot explain them, but what worldview can? The biblical worldview. We can explain all of those issues. And number 3, we must learn continually. Okay, the world of ideas is constantly growing. It's constantly coming at us. We are constantly being bombarded by experts, so we should be learners. And if you don't like to learn, you better start to strengthen that muscle, because we need to learn and grow. Autodidact is the idea of teaching ourselves. We need to be teachers of ourselves. We need to be readers and learners, and to be convinced that we need to always be reading and learning and growing. And then number 4, we must instruct our children. We have to prepare them to be launched out into the world. This is what I was talking about at the counseling conference yesterday. Of our kids are eventually going to be adults, right? That little boy standing in the back with his family may eventually be a doctor or a lawyer. He's eventually going to get to cast a vote on how our nation is run. He's eventually going to be a husband and father and provider, and we need to raise up our kids so that they are prepared, not just to be those things, but also to engage these ideas that I've talked about this morning. There's a very powerful quote from Wilberforce, who was the great English statesman who fought to end the slave trade in England. And he wrote a book on discipleship and spiritual growth. And what's amazing is that apologetics is a large part of what he wrote about. And this is what he says near the beginning of the book. He says, and again, this is over 200 years ago. In an age in which infidelity abounds, do we observe them, speaking of parents, carefully instructing their children in the principles of faith which they profess? Or do they furnish their children with arguments for the defense of that faith? They would blush on their child's birth to think him inadequate in any branch of knowledge or of any skill pertaining to his station in life. And he cultivates these skills with becoming diligence. But he is left to collect his religion as he may. The study of Christianity has formed no part of his education. His attachment to it, where any attachment to it exists at all, is too often not the preference of sober reason and conviction. Instead, his attachment to Christianity is merely the result of early and groundless prepossession. He was born in a Christian country, so of course he is a Christian. His father was a member of the Church of England, so that is why he is too. When religion is handed down among us by hereditary succession, it is not surprising to find youth of sense and spirit beginning to question the truth of the system in which they were brought up. And it is not surprising to see them abandon a position which they are unable to defend. Knowing Christianity chiefly by its difficulties and the impossibilities falsely imputed to it, they fall perhaps into the company of unbelievers. And this is the importance of parenting. This is the importance of discipleship, both in the home and in the church. And this is why these notes are so extensive. So that you can take them home and keep them. And all of this information that you have received this morning should eventually be passed on to your children. And if you need to spend some time thinking about it and reviewing it and making sense of it in your own mind and in your own heart, is that a good thing? Yeah, it's good to go and wrestle with these ideas. You need to, because your kids will be wrestling with them, whether you realize it or not. And so I hope and pray that this will be a helpful resource, and that as we continue this study of biblical worldview, that you'll store up all of this info and pass it along, because we have to prepare our children to one day be adults and deal with all of these ideas that are coming at us. And if they're coming at us quickly, you can bet it's going to come even faster towards them and their generation. But let me close in prayer, and then we'll get ready for the service. Father, we thank you so much